Hey everybody, it's Thursday on the Breakfast Club, and I just got off work, and I know it's late, but I on Thursdays I work in a city that's like an hour and a half away from me, so it takes a while to get home. So last week I talked about the humanity of politics and how politics just our human existence is inherently political because politics exists to regulate human existence, right? So you can't really separate the two and kind of talked about that and some of the fundamental differences between Democrats and Republicans or left and right or, just people all over the spectrum. Paul said that he couldn't hear me that well in my video. When I listened back, I could hear myself. So hopefully this alleviates some of the issues. I have a microphone on here. Crossing my fingers, guys. I'm really sorry about that. But today I kind of wanted to talk about, I want to go off Paul was talking about, the Florida shooting and some of the different, younger political activists that have been increasingly outspoken and increasingly put into the spotlight, which is great. And I wanted to talk about one of the counterpoints to that, which is that these people are too young to have these opinions, or they're too young to vote, or they're too young to, contribute to this conversation in a meaningful way because they haven't experienced life yet and they don't understand. And the first thing I want to say is I don't know how you can tell someone who watched their friends die that they haven't experienced life yet, because that's something that 99% of people in America will never go through. So, at least in that way. So I think that's a little bit of ridiculous. But I guess it's this idea that I'm thinking about of age. And when it comes to age of consent, when it comes to the ability to vote, when it comes to anything really. One of the big jokes that I've seen going around the internet is that, Republicans are saying that these kids are too young to have political opinions, yet they're old enough to date Roy Moore, who was, a 14-year-old girls were his thing, I guess. So that was kind of funny. But it's also, it's an interesting debate. So people mature, people get intelligent at different ages. I believe that some of these activists who are 16, 17, 18 years old are a lot more articulate and well-spoken and, have much more complex, nuanced, thought-out opinions than people I know that are 60 and have been doing politics their whole life. And so on one hand, I don't think I would be absolutely opposed to the idea of someone younger than 18 voting, especially because, again, like I talked about last week's video, like politics affect us. Politics aren't some abstract concepts that exist in the ether and it's just like a mental chess game, though that's what some politicians have turned it into. Politics directly affect our everyday life and have affected theirs extremely detrimentally. But on the other hand, and then people talk about like the age of consent. Well, if they're mature enough to vote, then they should be mature enough to consent to sex, right? With adults. So it's complicated, really, because the big thing is, until you're like 25, your frontal lobe's not done fully developing. So really, you could say that you can't consent to sex or you can't vote until you're 25. Which I'm not. So that's just a perspective that I'm looking at, which I think is interesting. And I think it's just a big, complicated thing, you know what I mean? Like, how do we gauge whether or not an individual, is mature enough to make certain decisions? There are people my age who I don't think are mature enough to consent to sex with an older adult, like say someone in their 30s, just because of their lived experiences and the whatever issues that they might have, psychologically, emotionally, whatever, and their particular rate of development. But at the same time, you can't say, like, oh, a 21-year-old can't consent to sex. So, and I'm sorry I'm like talking about these two issues like this, but I've just seen them juxtaposed over the past few weeks, and I just think it's interesting. So, really, I think, like, I think every individual is different, and you can't really make one big generalization about, when is okay to make these decisions. When are you mature enough to vote? When do you But we do have to, there has to be some kind of regulation again on when it's okay to vote, and when it's illegal to do X, Y, and Z, when it's legal to smoke, when it's legal to drink. When are you capable of making those decisions for yourself as a human being? Um, and it's hard. And I think that for me personally, I think the sex is different because, if you're like, I think that, for example, it's illegal for, at least in most places, for two, 15-year-olds to have sex with each other. It's not necessarily the smartest decision, but it's legal. But it's not legal for a 15-year-old to have sex with a 30-year-old, and that's because of besides the fact that, underdeveloped brain, but also like the fact that the inherent power dynamic that exists there, and the rates of abuse and sexual assault that occur in those types of relationships, and the exploitation that happens, and, just the fact that someone who is that age, who is attracted to someone who is that age, there's typically a pattern of, pedophilia and other issues. So that is, I think that you cannot conflate those two issues in that respect, because there's different reasons for each, right? So the reason that you can't vote at that young of age is because you're not considered an adult. And I don't know, because on one hand, like, you have kids who are, my mind goes to, like, you have kids who are indoctrinated by their parents to have certain beliefs, or their school system. I went to private school, for example, so there's a lot more influence over opinions in that regard. Well, actually, there might even be less, because private school teachers, at least in my school, were not allowed to talk about their political opinions. But I digress. So, at one hand, you'd be like, a 16-year-old can't vote because they don't know anything except for what's been around them and what they've been taught their whole lives. And on one hand, that's true. But on the other hand, I know plenty of adults who are exactly the same way, who've literally never stepped outside their circle of thought, and have, grown up with daddy's money and daddy's opinions, and that's never going to change. So there's that too. And so basically, it's just really difficult. Like, how do you deal with that issue? How do you decide who's mature enough to vote? How do you decide who's gotten enough nuance and stuff in their opinions to be able to vote? Why do we treat, children, like they're not human beings? Because they are, and they're directly impacted by all of these decisions. And so it's interesting to consider. And it's just something that I've been thinking about, because obviously, I don't want to be like, oh, everyone can vote, 5-year-olds can vote. But at the same time, like, these things are affecting them. They're a human being involved in our democracy. How do we cope with that? So those are just some thoughts, and I'd like to hear your opinions, because it's just something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Anyway, yeah, let me know what you think below, and I'll be reading the comments because I'm interested. And I'll see you guys next week. Yeah. Again, stay sane, stay strong. And I know it's, been a rough few weeks for everybody, I think. Have a good weekend.